Hello and welcome to the review video for World War II. The world is literally falling apart. I wonder what America's going to do about it. Nothing. At first. Question number one. Despite the fact that the war had been going on for 2 years, the U.S. remained neutral. Now, the United States is going to stay neutral even though Germany has taken over Europe and is bombing the heck out of Great Britain. It is not our war. We already fought in World War I. We don't want to get involved. No way, no way, no way. Even though this is the case, we will help a country out. We will especially help out Great Britain. Despite a strong isolationist sentiment at home, the U.S. increasingly helps Great Britain. I mean, hey, they were our original colonizer way back in the day. Besides that, they are the last vestige of European democracy fighting against Adolf Hitler as he takes over Europe. And what we do is we might lend or we might lease some of our equipment to Great Britain. This was called the Lend-Lease Act. It is when the president had the authority to sell or lend equipment to countries fighting the Axis power. Now, this mainly went to Great Britain, but you're giving them some old tanks or some old guns or some old planes. You're not bringing the troops in. You're not actually fighting the war. This was not lost on our president, President Franklin Roosevelt. He said the Lend-Lease Act was like lending a garden hose to a next-door neighbor whose house is on fire. Great Britain is burning to the ground, and we say, hey, old buddy, old pal, how about a tank? We won't send troops because remember, we are isolationists. We don't want to get involved. We don't need to get involved in a world war. So that's what's popping in Europe. In Asia, remember this is a world war, so there's lots of stuff happening. Japan is on the move. Japan is going to pick up lands in northern China and Manchuria, and the U.S. refuses to recognize these conquests. Japan is doing this so they can, Japan, not very large, wants to take over land to get resources. So we say, we ain't selling you any of our resources. The U.S. imposed an embargo on oil and steel to Japan. That does not mean war. Don't think, oh, that means Pearl Harbor. No, 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 no. No, they're taking over land. The U.S. does not like it. The U.S. is negotiating with Japan to avoid war, but says, no, oil and steel, we are hitting you with an embargo. Now, with that said, while negotiations were happening and without warning, Japan will attack. They will attack the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. And that date becomes part of one of the most famous one-liners in American history when President FDR goes before Congress and says,
yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
And when he says that, he asks Congress to declare war on Japan, which they do. So all that isolationist stuff is over. The U.S. is involved. And if the U.S. is involved, then this is truly a world war. The debates of isolationism are done. World War II is now truly a world war because the United States of America is involved. Now, before, as much as you want to just reach over and punch Hitler in the face, it can't be done just yet. We need to talk about a few things going on in America. Let's talk about minority participation in the war effort in World War II. You know, about 1.4 African Americans served in the military in World War II, but most of them served in segregated non-combat roles. But don't be confused, they demanded the right to serve in combat roles. By and large, African Americans were not happy with the assignments they were given, and so they were going to demand the right to serve in combat. You know, there was one fighter squadron that was the exception to this rule. That, we're still on question number 8, would of course be the Tuskegee Airmen. The Tuskegee Airmen served in Europe with distinction. So, mostly non-combat, but there are exceptions in the Tuskegee Airmen were the exception to that rule. All right, number 9. There's a Japanese internment going on. We're going to talk about that in a second. But even with that said, there were Nisei regiments. These were Asian American regiments, primarily Japanese Americans, who they earned a high number of decorations. So these minority units, these segregated units, performed extremely well. One non-segregated unit were Mexican Americans. They served in World War II, but they were integrated. They were not segregated like Japanese Americans and like African Americans were. All right, cool, great, awesome, good. Hey, you're looking at 2 Americans. You were looking at 2 Native Americans. Those would be members of the Navajo people. And Navajo communication codes were used in the Pacific to translate information so that Japan doesn't intercept and know what the U.S. is going to do. It was impossible for the Japanese to break these codes because the Navajo language is oral. It is not written, okay? It's not like a Japanese guy can go to the library and pick up the book on how to learn how to speak Navajo. You can't. It's just oral, and that is how the U.S. is able to maintain communication without ever being intercepted. A great contribution of the Navajo people. All right, war on the home front, okay? You got to draft soldiers. And what's the name of the organization that does that? Well, the Selective Service. The draft was conducted by the Selective Service. It still is, if there were a draft. And it is used to provide personnel for the military. Many people were drafted. Many people volunteered to fight instead. But you got a lot of people fighting, okay? You got to give them resources, though. You got to give them tanks and bombers and guns. A reason for the perfect, or almost perfect, allocation of resources, the mass amount of war materials that were made, was because of the combination of U.S. government and industry. They forged a close relationship, an extremely close relationship, so much so that businesses retooled to wartime production to allocate resources effectively. For example, Ford, which used to make all cars all the time, well, now they're making tanks. Now they're making bombers. So government and industry are working together. All right. American people are limiting their consumption of things like meat, like milk, like gasoline, like tires. This was called rationing. Rationing was in force. You got ration stamps, and you had to use them wisely. And the reason was to maintain a supply of essential products to the war effort. Save as much stuff as you possibly can so that it can go to fight Hitler, to fight the Empire of Japan. All right, so that's rationing. What about raising money to actually pay for the war? Well, there are 2 ways that the United States paid for World War II. One was war bonds, and you see all these posters. Doing all you can, brother. You read that poster, you say, no, I'm not doing all I can. I'm going to buy a war bond today. And income taxes. Income taxes were raised in order to finance the war. All right, good, great, awesome. What about media communication? How did they assist? Well, first, there was strict censorship of war reporting. You weren't going to listen to your radio and hear some reporter talk, oh, things look bad for the U.S. A big loss will be coming anytime now. Morale is really low. No, because the U.S. made sure that stuff didn't get out. They were strictly censored. And the reason is that you want to have public morale and ad campaigns. You want to keep Americans focused on the war effort. The U.S. is constantly running newsreel, radio ads, whatever, to keep people thinking about the war in a good way, not in a, oh, things are bad. No, that ain't going to happen. That's going to get censored out, even if it did exist. You know, Hollywood stepped up to the plate as well. The entertainment industry produced movies and plays and shows which boosted morale and patriotic support. The theme of a lot of the movies you would watch would be, let's win World War II, let's defeat Japan, let's defeat Hitler, as well as they portrayed the enemy in often stereotypical ways, especially in very racist ways when dealing with the Empire of Japan, okay? So, let's flip that guide to the backside and talk about women, African Americans on the home front during World War II. Now, if you have so many men drafted by the Selective Service, then you have lots of jobs. a lot of these jobs were filled by women. A nickname for women who replaced men in the workforce was Rosie the Riveter. This popular image was all throughout the United States of America to describe these women who were replacing the men who are obviously serving in the military. Now, there is also a flood of African Americans from the South to cities, especially in the North, because they're seeking jobs, war jobs that are made available because of the Great World War. Another name for, remember, this large migration is the Great Migration, but you're just seeing another example of it. African Americans campaigned for victory in war. Let's beat Japan, let's beat Hitler, and for equality at home, because down south you still got those Jim Crow laws, so they're looking to win twice, beat beat the Axis powers in World War II and defeat the Jim Crow segregation laws. All right, internment of Japanese Americans. Question number 18 is provided for you. The Japanese Americans in the West Coast were relocated to internment camps. You know that, but the question is why? Well, there were two reasons. First reason is because there was just a strong anti-Japanese prejudice on the West Coast. There's really an anti-Asian prejudice on the West Coast at this time. Remember the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, a law which outlawed the immigration of Chinese. Now, there's Japanese prejudice as well, so that's one reason. Here's another reason. Here's the bigger reason. There was a fear of treason. There was a false belief that the Japanese Americans were aiding the enemy, were aiding the Empire of Japan, even though they had come to the United States, so they're not really over there, but that fear is that they were. Now, it wasn't actually the case. There's not this great evidence that this was happening, but that's why the internment happened, okay? You know, there was a lawsuit that went all the way to the Supreme Court saying, we shouldn't have this. This is awful that we're having this internment. The Supreme Court upheld the internment. That's key. That was a 5-4 decision. That's as close as you can get. So that's an argument. But the Supreme Court said in a time of war that, yeah, this is okay. This is necessary, all right? Later, the U.S. government would apologize and made payments to the survivors of the Japanese internment camps. So there would be an apology for this later and money, but at the time, the Supreme Court upheld the internment, all right? Okay, let's start talking about some major battles of World War II. First, let's talk strategy. In Europe, the big idea of the Axis really being led, of the Allies being led by the United States to beat the Axis is called the defeat Hitler first strategy. It's that Hitler is, I don't know, the worst person ever created. So why don't we get rid of him first? Why don't we tear down Nazi Germany? We'll put most of our resources and efforts to Europe, okay? So that's the game plan in the European theater. In the Pacific theater, it's all about island hopping. The United States would like to jump over islands in order to get real close to Japan, get closer and closer and closer to Japan, because then you can use those islands as a base to attack, to bomb Japan. Also, once you have control of the waters, you can cut off Japanese supplies by using submarine warfare. But this whole thing is called island hopping, all right? Now, let's fight ourselves the war. It gets ugly for the United States at first because Japan will capture the U.S.-held Philippines. Remember, the Philippines originally gained by the United States in the Spanish-American War when they were annexed. Well, Japan takes them away from the United States. That's the difficult thing. Here's the way times worse thing: the Bataan Death March. American POWs suffered brutal treatment by the Japanese. They had to go on a forced march where they were withheld of water, of food, where there was murder, where there is torture left and right. And it all happened in the Philippines at the Bataan Death March, okay? Now, one reason that POW treatment was so bad in the Pacific, well, it reflected the savagery of the fighting there. And Japanese soldiers would often prefer to commit suicide rather than to surrender. That shows the how fierce the Japanese soldiers would fight, so how difficult it is to beat Japan for these islands, because they'd rather commit suicide than actually surrender, okay? Now, Japanese leaders, they had their strategy as well. They hoped that America would accept Japanese predominance in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. So the goal is we're going to take over pretty much everything that we can in Southeast Asia and the Pacific so that you, America, don't want to fight us. You don't want to get into a war with us because it's going to be too costly. It's not worth reversing our gains. There will be too much bloodshed. That's Japan's hope. Well, the two goals meet. They meet kind of middle of the way. They meet at Midway. But before we talk about Midway, I would like to first talk about question number 26. Because in Europe, Normandy, the D-Day invasions were led by Dwight Eisenhower. Eisenhower of the U.S. will lead the D-Day invasions. And this is where American troops, the Allies led by the Americans, landed in German-occupied France on June 6, 1944. An important date to remember, June 6 of 1944. Now, once these troops have landed, it's a big deal because it succeeds and it begins the liberation of Western Europe from Hitler. At that point, everything Hitler has gained in Europe, he begins losing. He gets pushed all the way back to Berlin, where eventually the Nazis will surrender on May 7th, 1945. So the war in Europe is done, and D-Day is the key, led by Eisenhower. Liberation of Western Europe. Let's go. Now, I got a little bit excited. I'm sorry, history does that to me. I meant to talk in better order about this one. Remember the Battle of Midway. It was called the Miracle of Midway, and in the Miracle of Midway, the U.S. defeated a much larger Japanese force. Okay, Japanese victory, if they would have picked up Midway, would have allowed them to attack Hawaii, but it didn't happen. It was an underdog event because the U.S. had less of a naval presence at the time. But remember, the key to Midway is that it ended the Japanese threat to Hawaii, and it began the policy of island hopping. Island hopping, of course, with the goal of carrying the war closer and closer to Japan. So, everything stops at Midway. Midway's the turning point in the Pacific. Now, Japan is being beaten back and back and back, and island hopping does occur. Two of the most difficult islands to take were Iwo Jima and Okinawa. They brought American forces closer to Japan. That's the big goal, but at the cost of thousands of American lives. And it makes sense because remember, the Japanese soldiers are going to fight fiercely over every square inch of the islands. They fought extremely fiercely because of the mentality of the Japanese soldier at that time, which was commit suicide rather than surrender. Fight for every single inch. Iwo Jima and Okinawa, they do get obtained, but can you imagine for just 1 second how difficult it would be for the U.S. to invade Japan, to invade the mainland? Well, faced with the prospect of horrendous casualties from invading Japan, President Harry Truman makes a very controversial decision. He orders the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki to be bombed. The atomic bomb is dropped on both Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Very controversial. But the reason for Truman was that if we can end the war, then we can avoid invading Japan. And in that sense, he was exactly right. Tens of thousands were killed, and shortly after, Japan surrenders, avoiding the need for the U.S. to invade Japan. Well, World War II is over. The world is in shambles. We're going to have to put this stuff back together, and it's getting a little cold in here. Cold War.